And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Mark Anthony, psychic explorer, also known as the psychic lawyer. He's not only a fourth-generation psychic medium who communicates with spirits, but also an Oxford-educated attorney licensed to practice law in Florida and Washington, D.C., as well as before the United States Supreme Court. Mark, thanks for joining me. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Jeff. I always enjoy working with you, and thank you for having me on your podcast.
So, as far as I'm understanding, you were born this way, right? Since you're a fourth generation psychic.
I was. I've tracked this on and through my family, on both sides of the family, back into the 1890s.
Oh.
So we figure that's about 4 generations. And there's a whole new crop of little kids coming into the family, and so I'm real curious to see which one or ones of them word emerges. And both my parents had these abilities. And the thing is, Jeff, both sides of the family could not possibly have been more different. My mother's family emigrated from Italy in the early part of the 20th century. And the Italian American community of New Jersey, North New Jersey, and New York City is where they lived. And my maternal great grandmother, Giovanna, was known as the woman who knows things. And Catholic Church officials would meet with her and talk to her about faith and her perceptions of spirituality. And then my mother inherited that. My dad's family came over to the New World in 1693. We charted that, and they were very conservative Pennsylvania Baptists. And it runs in that family too, because my dad had 4 siblings, and he and his sister Marjorie had these abilities. The other ones didn't. His mother, Isabel, and their maternal grandmother, Grace. Now, my dad was a U.S. Navy SEAL, and then after the Navy, an aerospace engineer. So he's at a USO dance, and he said, I saw this foxy-looking dame. He's talking about my mom, who worked in high-end retail, and she was only 17 years old. But the way she was dressed, because she always got the designer fashions, wholesale, working in the industry. And she said that when they met, they just connected. And she was a good Italian girl, so they're always chaperoned and all this. But on their the third dance that they met at, she told him, "There's something about me you need to know." And she said, I see spirits. And of course, my dad replied, Jeff, as only a sailor could, with several colorful metaphors and adjectives leading to I do too. And so I came along later. It was a couple years before they got married, and they had me later in life. And there I was, about 3.5 years old, and I start seeing my invisible friends, which both mommy and daddy could see as well. And I actually remember the reactions. Mom was like, "Oh, he's got it." And my dad was like, "Ah, geez, he's got it." So they had very different reactions.
Growing up in a psychic family, did you guys talk about psychic stuff all the time? Or, how did that play out?
We didn't go around like, "Oh, we are so gifted." It was just part of life. I'd come home from school, and my mom would say, "I felt and saw a spirit today." And I'd be like, "Cool. Do we have any peanut butter?" And she'd go, "Yeah, honey, it's over there. You can make a sandwich." Or around the dinner table. See, my dad's family was Baptist. My mother's family was Italian Catholic. But my dad, he had to ask my grandfather, who was from Italy, permission to marry my mother. And the stories about her are funny. He sat in this chair and he's like, "What the religion are you?" And he said, "Baptist." He goes, "Baptist, if you want to marry my genie, you must have become a Catholic." So my dad went through it. And back in those days, that was, a lot of rigmarole, but he did it. He loved my mother very, very much. And so when I was getting ready to go to Catholic school, I started first grade when I was 5. My father said, "Mark, you can talk about this all you want to your mother and I, but you must never talk about this outside of the family." because people who see things that others don't get taken away. Whoa, that really frightened me. And I found out why years later. His sister Marjorie, who was a very gifted medium, and she could foresee future events. And this is years before I was born, Jeff. And they lived in Pennsylvania, and she married this guy who was a religious fanatic, for lack of a better term. And he didn't like her abilities, and it frightened him. And one day he was getting ready to go to work, and he was a machinist, and he worked at a steel plant in Pennsylvania. And Aunt Marjorie had this terrible feeling, this dread, this pain in her stomach. She begged him not to go to work because she said something horrible is going to happen. And they got into a big argument, and she started crying, and he said, fine, I'll stay home. Well, that day, a crane was lifting a couple thousand pounds of steel beams, and all of a sudden the cable snapped, and the beams crushed the machine shop that he worked in and killed everybody in it. Now, it's logical to assume, had he been at work, he would have been killed. And the thing is, Jeff, you would think that he would have been grateful. Instead, it intensified his fear, and he found an unscrupulous psychiatrist who diagnosed Marjorie as a paranoid schizophrenic suffering from hallucinations and delusions. They sent an ambulance with these guys in white coats. They literally put her into a straitjacket, pulled her out of her home. She was screaming, begging them not to do this. They took her to a mental institution where she was forcibly subjected against her will to electroshock therapy for over 6 months. And after that, my dad said she was never the same. She never talked about future events or seeing spirits. They did so much damage to her. And I never met my Aunt Marjorie. So this happened before I was born. And that is why when I was starting school at 5, my dad wasn't trying to scare me. He was worried. He said, people who see things others don't get taken away. And I remember I was trembling, and he held me. Dad was a tough guy, Navy SEAL, but man, he loved his kids. And he was a good dad, great dad. And he reassured me, and I didn't know about any of this until I got older and I started asking questions. And then my parents sat down and told me the whole story. So we talked about it. It was part of our lives. But the thing is, people in the neighborhood kind of knew our family was a bit different. I always like to joke that we were kind of like the Addams family in the neighborhood, weird, but kind of cool weird. And but it was always there, but we weren't public about it.
I feel like being a psychic could be just a general term, kind of a blanket term. What abilities do you have?
It's like saying I'm a doctor. Well, or I'm an attorney, which I am, but there's different types of attorneys. Like there's different types of psychics. There's some psychics who are strictly medical intuitives. There's some that work on precognitive future events. And then there's psychic mediums. And then there's different types of mediums. There's mental mediums, that's what I am. There are trance mediums, which some people refer to as channelers. And then very, very rare, there's physical mediums, which are supposedly able to get the spirits to appear, like to physically manifest. And I've yet to see any physical medium that I think was legitimate. But what a medium does is a medium tunes into a higher frequency known as the other side, whereas a psychic tunes into the frequency of a person, place, or thing, which is how he or she is able to discern things about their health or future events, things going on with them. So in other words, we tune into frequency, we're just tuning into different stations, if you will.
So as a mental medium, I'm still not completely clear on that. How does the information come to you?
A mental medium, we all hear the terms clairvoyant. Back in the 19th century, during the golden age of mediumship. It was very popular both in Europe and the United States. And French terms for clairvoyance, which is seeing visions, clairaudience, which is hearing auditory message, clairsentience, which is feeling physical sensations, like my Aunt Marjorie clutching her stomach because she felt a future event that was going to be negative. There's clairgustance, which is tasting, clairscent, which is smelling things, and then there's clairsavance, where you're given direct information. So what a mental medium does is when a spirit communicates with us, they're not taking over our body, they're emitting waves of frequency and electromagnetic frequency, which goes into my brain, and that EM frequency then interacts with the electrical field in my brain and then gets converted into recognizable concepts based on my memories, feelings, or cultural associations. So, for example, I was doing a reading for this mother and daughter recently, and um, uh, her son, who was the daughter's brother, obviously had passed, and he comes through, and all of a sudden he starts showing me coconuts, coconuts, coconuts. And the mother's like, no, 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 no. And the daughter goes, wait a second. When we were kids, we got in this big argument. And I remember I grabbed a coconut and I threw it, and I just missed my brother's head like that. And she said it was terrible at the time, but now it turned out to be a funny story later in life. And then the mother said, wait a second. I was at a bar the other night, at a function, and I did something I never do. I ordered one of those tropical drinks that was in a coconut, where they had the little umbrella and all that. Now, what was going on there? The coconut is what I've termed a multiple meaning message. It had more than one level of significance. He was bringing up the coconut as a shared memory between he and his sister, and simultaneously letting him know, hey, mom, I'm around you. I know what's happening. Because sometimes people say, well, why do they bring up these random things? These are not random things. You have to realize that communicating with spirits is not Siri, Alexa, or Google. Okay, we're interfacing with a different dimension, and spirits are emitting these EM waves of frequency into our brain. And once as the medium, I start getting confirmation on what may initially seem more trivial or less significant things. That's how they're building a rapport. So once I got the coconut message, then the spirit started giving me deeper messages because his spirit had tuned into me and vice versa. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of remote viewing. And I had a discussion with actually this medical doctor that I believe the right side of your brain just picks up symbols, and then the left side tells the story.
Right.
And I could have them reversed. I don't remember which way
No,
was
the
which.
right side in studies, and when I practiced law, was really fascinating. When I went into mediumship full time, one of my specializations was head injury litigation. And so I had to study the human brain. The left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. The right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. But it's more to it than just that. The left side of the brain controls logical functions, vision, hearing, speech. That's why people get a left brain stroke or left head injury oftentimes are speech impaired afterwards because it damages that side. So basically get the facts, figures, data, logical, the visions. The right side of the brain is the conceptual, the ethereal, the groovy baby side of the brain. And that's where, let's say I come in and I get coconut, and then the next message may be a sensation or a feeling, which when I describe it, it will resonate with the recipient. And the thing is, these EM impulses that the spirit is sending, as they go into my brain and my brain begins to process it, if it's data oriented, the left side of the brain handles it. If it's metaphorical or if it is sensory, then the right side of the brain handles it. So we have to look at our brain as a very sophisticated formatting, processing device. And people say, well, that sounds like, hogwash. But the thing is, we both speak English. So I'm sending sound wave vibration at you that has a number of sounds that your brain is converting into recognizable concepts based on my feelings, your feelings, memories, and cultural associations. Ich spreche Deutsch auf Deutsch, dein ist dein Family. Okay, if you don't understand German, it's going to be gibberish. And so spirit communication is learning that. And for all our German speaking listeners, my German's terrible. I speak Tarzan German, but it's funny when I'm in Germany, I can get the message across them. And I used to be better with Spanish, but it's if you don't use it all the time. But the point is, it's the same basic concept. If you don't understand the language, it will appear to be gibberish. Once you begin to work with it, you'll begin to understand it.
When you started doing this, did you have any self-doubt? And if you did have this self-doubt, how did you overcome it?
Practice, as with any skill, any ability. It's like Michael Phelps. I'm sure when he was a little kid, if he jumped in a pool, he could probably swim really well, but he needed the training, he needed the practice to become this incredible Olympic swimmer. It's the same thing with musicians, mathematicians. I mean, if you look at like Stephen Hawking was always brilliant, but he had to study physics and mathematics to come up with the theories that he did. And part of being a medium is overcoming the self-doubt. Say it. For example, I was doing a reading for this woman recently, and her grandfather came through. Her grandfather on her mother's side of the family. And I started describing him. She said, yes, that's how grandpa passed. And, I was getting some information. I said, well, there's another man with him. And I almost hesitated, Jeff. I said, this is going to sound weird, but he looks like Walt Disney. And there was a hesitation. And she said, well, my grandfather was an animator and he worked for Walt Disney and knew him. And they worked together in the 1920s. And it's like, oh. And so it was really cool because Walt Disney had come in with her father. Now, her father actually had the connection. He knew Disney. He was friends with Disney. There was a whole lot more to this, as it turned out, because I kept getting Anaheim, not Orlando. I was getting Anaheim, and she said, and the client said, "Oh my God," she said, "it's a big problem in the family." I go, "Why?" She said, "Disney offered him to be partners and work with the development of Disneyland, and my grandfather wanted no part of it." And she said that since that time, everyone in the family's very angry because they would be billionaires today. But the thing is, there was a lot more than just, see, first I got Disney. Yes, he worked for Disney, but as I continued to work for him, and then he started saying Anaheim and showing me Disneyland in California. So the initial message, yes, it's great that it was Disney, but it's like a flower. It blooms, it blossoms, it unfolds. And part of being an experienced medium is working with that and letting the spirit give you the information. Now, the problem can be with the client. No, that doesn't make sense. No, I don't understand it. Why would he bring up Walt Disney? That happened a long time ago. When they start knowing, overthinking, hyperanalyzing, arguing, and being very closed. Like I was doing a reading recently for a group, and I kept getting chemicals, chemistry lab, all these chemicals. No. And at the end of the session, this one guy said, well, I work in a chemical factory. I think that was about me, but I didn't say anything. So by rejecting that and knowing, it's like slamming the door energetically in the spirit's faces, and they will back off. So if that guy would have said, yes, I'm a chemical engineer and I work at a chemical plant, then that would have continued the connection with whatever spirit was coming through, and then he would have gotten a whole array of messages. So a lot of times people say, well, I went to that medium wasn't any good. Well, yeah, because the whole time the client shoots everything down, overanalyzes things, interrupts the medium, and then wants only what they want. Because I want is another form of the no syndrome, as I've termed it, and it creates an energetic block. And I'm not trying to say this to say like, oh, well, if it doesn't go right, it's the client's fault. You have to realize in a reading, think of it like a triangle. There's three parties involved. There's the medium, there's the recipient, the client, and then at the top of the triangle is the other side, and that's a collective of spirits. They're sending messages to me. I'm conveying it to the client. The client confirms or, or has to think about it. But when the client becomes disruptive, negative, overly analytical, hostile, they're creating an energetic block. But when you don't have that, then things start rocking and rolling. And you've probably seen this because I know that you've worked with a lot of mediums, because I've seen, and I've seen all kinds of mediums work. And I see where the pit stops happen. Because a lot of times with people, um, like with the coconuts, the mother said no, and then the daughter said, "Hey, I remember this," and that gave the mother a moment to release the no block and say, the other day I had this weird tropical drink in a coconut. And so when it removed the block, then the spirit comes through. It's all about energy and frequency.
At some point in your life, you decided to become an attorney, and then you evolved into becoming the psychic explorer. Where on your journey did you take being psychic seriously and start practicing, as you mentioned earlier?
It's always been part of my skill set as a psychic medium, and I could sit here all day and tell stories about how I used it in court or in the practice of law. But when I was a teenager, I wanted to go into the clergy, because that is, a lot of mediums are drawn to the spiritual. But as I discussed it with my parents, the problem with religion is it's very constricting. You can only believe this. You have to believe this scripture. And I found it too limiting, and I found it was filled with too many rules and regulations. So then, Jeff, I ended up in the practice of law, which has lots of rules and regulations. I mean, an incredible array of them. Um, but both jobs are about evidence. As an attorney, you have to have evidence to prove your case. As a medium, you have to have evidence to identify and substantiate, guarantee the authenticity of the contact. And so I went into the practice of law, and then my mother died. And we were very, very close. I was at my law office one day, and she called me up and she said, "Hey, honey, if you're free for lunch, I made spaghetti with broccoli rabe, okay, broccolini." And I thought, well, that will be really nice. And my parents' home was only about 5 miles from my office, so I went there and had a beautiful lunch with my parents, and we were talking about the upcoming holidays and what we were going to do. And mom looked tired that day, and dad seemed fine. But as I was leaving, my mom hugged me and said, "I love you so much. I- I'm so glad you're my son." Now, we were a very tactile and very affectionate family, but I'll never forget. And I said to her, "I love you too, Mom." But there was a finality to that. I've run this back my mind hundreds of times. The next day I was in court, and the judge's assistant came into the courtroom and said, "Mark, we need you in chambers right now." And I knew it was bad. And I took the phone, and my secretary was in tears, and she said, "Your dad called, your mom died." And she'd had what's known as ventricular fibrillation. The electrical system in her heart gave out. She died peacefully in her sleep. Well, needless to say, I was devastated. I'm very close to my family, to my parents. And so about 2 weeks after that, Jeff, I was driving back from court. And also, when those waves of grief hit me, we all get those. You think you have it kind of under control, and then a tsunami hit me, and I said, "I got to pull over. I can't walk into my office in tears. I got to deal with this." Sit there in my car, and I pull over into some convenience store parking lot, and I'm sitting there. Took a deep breath, and all of a sudden there was this flash of light in the car, and I turned to the passenger seat, and I saw the silhouette of my mother in this silver white light. And I'm like, okay. And then I hear her voice: "Mark, you have the gift of mediumship so that you would not be crushed by grief, but now you must help those who are suffering from their grief." All right, Jeff, I'm trying to process this, and I'm breaking out in a sweat from head to toe. And then the second message in her voice said, "Mark, it is your life's mission to help people understand understand that God exists, that heaven exists, that souls are immortal living spirits, that humans can communicate with souls, and that we will all be reunited when it is your time to leave your world into and come into the light. All right. Now I sink back into the seat in my car. I'm now drenched in sweat. And all I can think to say is, okay. And then it dawns on me. I said, I can't tell anybody this. They're going to think I'm insane, because the fear arose. And then another sense came through me that my life had just changed forever. And there was no turning back. And within a year, within a month, I was offered a job at a government agency to head up court operations. So that meant I could sell my law practice, divest myself from my firm. So I didn't have, 150 clients at one time, And then my book, Never Letting Go, came out. And my manager, Rocky, I brought her on board. She got me a speaking gig in New York City, which is really cool, at MSNBC. And we were at 30 Rock. And I was, being interviewed in the studio next to where they were filming Saturday Night Live. It was just really a neat experience. But then she got me a speaking event at Harvard in Boston. So we're up in Boston. And I remember it was not long before Christmas, because we had coffee and hot chocolate, and it was steaming, and Harvard's beautiful, and it was all decorated. And all of a sudden the phone rings, and it's the elected official of the government agency. And he started complaining that the Republican Party is outraged that there's a psychic on the staff. And I said, well, you didn't hire me because I'm a psychic. Okay, you hired me because of my abilities. He go, I know all that, but I'm catching all kinds of flack. And he's going on and on and on. And I said, let me make this simple for you, sir. And he goes, how so? I said, please accept this as my resignation. He said, okay. And I hung up my phone and I looked at Rocky and I said, Rocky, I just quit the practice of law. And Jeff, she said to me, Mark, look around. I'm looking around. She goes, where are you? I said, Harvard. She goes, and what are you doing in an hour? Giving a lecture about life after death and signing copies of my new book, Never Letting Go. And she said, don't you think this is exactly where you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to be doing? And that is how I went from being a lawyer to the psychic lawyer and the psychic explorer.
As a psychic explorer, what does that entail you doing?
That's one of the fun parts of what I do, because I've spent the better part of my life examining mystical and spiritual sites from Stonehenge to Machu Picchu, the pyramids in Mexico, Native American ruins, temples throughout Asia, and many places in the United States that are energetic vortexes. So I study paranormal and supernatural phenomenon. In fact, I'm going to be on an upcoming episode of a new Discovery Channel series called Destinations of the Damned, where they brought me in to do an investigation to see what I felt at an abandoned sanatorium in Indiana. That was a cool gig, because of course, we're filming it at midnight, and it was as creepy as can be, and all that. But I've also, like I said, been to several Native American ruins, temples throughout Asia, Central and South America, and I examine these as a psychic medium. Also have a background and interest in theology, philosophy, archaeology, and I speak on ancient mysteries. So I do a lot of investigation work, and the lecture series and speaking tours that I conduct, not just on spirit communication, but also on reincarnation, ancient mysteries. I just did a presentation at the Edgar Cayce Association for Research and Enlightenment on the secrets, mysteries, and curse of Tutankhamun. Really fascinating stuff, and there's some paranormal, possibilities there. Along with, I will be headlining at the International Association for Near-Death Studies, talking about the last 50 years. Actually, I'm going back to about the last 3,000 years of how near-death experiences have influenced and affected world history. So all these things that I do, the media started calling me the psychic explorer. So here we were. I was talking to my publicist and my manager, and it's like we shortened things down to Mark Anthony, JD, Juris Doctor, which is my law degree, comma, psychic explorer. So that way it puts it all together. So I speak on and do a wide array of topics, and I've been on a number of TV shows. Also, I appear as a legal analyst on a number of shows as well, particularly when the legal system and the paranormal collide, which actually does happen.
I find it fascinating that you mentioned these NDEs affecting historical policy or historical facts or something. Can you tell us more about that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In the 1820s, there was this boy, and he fell from a horse, and he was rendered, at first they thought unconscious, then they thought he was dead for 8 hours. And then he suddenly came back to life. And he was a strange kid to begin with. I mean, he was always reading, real bookworm, but also very gregarious and outgoing. And he started talking about divine interposition, another realm, the transcendent faith. And they noticed after that that he began to talk about things that came true. In other words, he had precognitive ability. His name was Abraham Lincoln. And in the wake of that, it was well known to people in Lincoln's circle that he had precognitive ability. When he was elected president and he and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, were getting ready to go to Washington, he looked in a mirror and he had a vision that said to him he would be elected twice as president, but not survive his second term. One of the side effects of a near-death experience is enhanced psychic ability. And the Lincoln administration was very heavily involved in spiritual and psychic phenomenon. By the time they got to the White House, the Lincolns had already lost a little boy in 1850 due to, I believe it was typhoid. Then while they were in the White House, their favorite son, Willie Todd Lincoln, died as well from typhoid. And then it was the night of April 13th, 1865, and Lincoln had a recurring dream, which he mentioned to his press secretary. Let me back up a bit. The Lincolns had lost two sons, and First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln was very upset, very distressed. I mean, what mother wouldn't be? And the president was too. And she brought a medium to the White House, Nettie Colburn Maynard, and at least 4 seances were conducted at the White House, Abraham Lincoln attending the first one. Now, this was supposed to be secret. Do you think it was secret? I mean, come on. Something like this happens. The White House staff tells the press. Now it gets out. And the press didn't like Mary Todd Lincoln to begin with. Now she's a certifiable kook, according to them. So this is causing a lot of, tension. And they said that she was insane and all this and everything. Meanwhile, the Civil War is going on. And Robert Todd Lincoln, the Lincoln's oldest son, is at the 6th Street train station in Washington, D.C., and he's standing on the platform, and someone like in the crowd bumps into him, and he almost falls in the way of an oncoming train, and somebody grabs him and pulls him out of the way. And it happened to be the younger brother of John Wilkes Booth, who was the assassin who killed Abraham Lincoln, shot him in the head in front of his wife. Okay. Now, isn't that a twist of karma? One of the Booth brothers rescues Robert Todd Lincoln. The other one assassinates the greatest president I believe this country has ever had. Well, Lincoln keeps having a series of dreams, and the last time he had it was April 13th of 1865. He saw himself in I think it was the green room or the east room of the White House, and he in the dream there's a bunch of women crying around a coffin and a soldier standing there, and he says to the soldier, "Who died?" And the soldier says, "It's the president." And in the dream he sees himself in the coffin. He had that dream the night before he was assassinated, and we know this because he told his press secretary John Hay, who notated it in his diary. Then the next night he was indeed assassinated. So Lincoln had this precognitive ability. His wife kept consulting with mediums. And then a couple years later, her other son, I believe it was Edward Lincoln, died of typhoid. So now Mary Todd Lincoln has lost 3 sons. She sees her husband murdered in front of her, shot in the head at point blank range. The media says she's crazy. She's got a streak of melancholy, which is what they call depression. Now, let's take all that in aside from the fact that her family was fighting for the Confederacy and her president was, Abraham Lincoln, and throw on top of it menopause. I think history needs to give another look at Mary Todd Lincoln. She remained a devout spiritualist her entire life. And her surviving son, Robert Todd Lincoln, got into a dispute with her and actually put her on trial for her own mental sanity. But the thing is, this was a grieving mother at a time when there weren't grief support groups or counseling. She was a widow, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, not only from seeing her husband murdered, but watching 3 of her sons die, and she was at the bedside of each one of them. The press was hounding her. She was menopausal. Her own family turned against her. The press was on her case. Who wouldn't show signs of depression? So this is part of one of the talks that I give called Rulers, Royals, Psychics, and Spirits, the mystics behind the thrones of power. That's also a snippet of what I'll be giving on how a near-death experience influenced world history. Think about it. If Abraham Lincoln did not have that near-death experience, that was a spiritually transformative experience. He was already an intellect, but now it gave him enhanced precognitive psychic abilities. It changed him, made him a deeper and more intense person. Was he not in the right place at the right time?
That's an amazing story that I was completely unaware of. Are there any other historical figures that have had an NDE?
Oh, yes. In the Middle Ages, there was a young aristocrat in north central Italy, Giovanni Pietro di Bernardoni. Okay, I love his name, Giovanni Pietro di Bernardoni. And his father was a wealthy silk merchant, fabric merchant. And like young men at the time, he joined the military to seek his fame and fortune. And of course, Italy at the time was a mess. I mean, because there were a number of city-states, it was not a unified country. And he went to war against a neighboring city-state. And in his first campaign, he was taken prisoner and then held in a dungeon for over a year. And he became deathly ill. And he was wafting between life and death. And then he was released from prison because they cut a deal, his city state with this one. And when he left, he wanted to rejoin the army, but he collapsed and he went into a non-responsive state. He said that he saw a light and a voice spoke to him that said, "You must rebuild my house. It has fallen into disrepair." And he came out of the experience, and we know him now as Saint Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis had started off as a wealthy aristocrat in an army as a soldier, and then he had this profound NDE where everything changed. He became a champion of peace. He spoke out against discrimination. He supposedly was an animal communicator. Now, this was in a time, this was in the 1200s, and the Catholic Church was documenting this. He would go and talk to animals, and like birds would land on his hands. There was a wolf that was terrorizing a village, and they said that he went and spoke to the wolf and embraced it, and it stopped killing people after that. But I think one of the most fascinating things, this was also during the Crusades. And I don't mean to give a history lecture, but the Crusades were a series of religious wars waged by Europeans against Muslims in the Near East. And the Seventh Crusade invaded Egypt for the purpose of taking the city called Damietta on the Nile Delta to use as a springboard to attack north through Gaza and into Jerusalem. Well, the Seventh Crusade, unfortunately, is facing the armies of Sultan al-Kamil, the Turkish commander, and a really brilliant one, and things weren't going well. About a year after the siege of Damietta, St. Francis arrives. It is still unknown to this day, Jeff, how he did this. He crossed enemy lines. Somehow or other, St. Francis got into the Muslim camp, and he was brought before the Sultan, and they spent 7 days together talking about theology and praying together. And St. Francis tried to convert Sultan al-Kamil, who was a devout Muslim, and he appreciated him and recognized him as a holy man. And he said, I will grant you and your followers safe passage to Jerusalem. And St. Francis brokered a peace deal that the Sultan would allow the Crusaders to pass through to take Jerusalem, which is what they wanted. Well, it goes back to the camp, Crusader camp, and the Crusader armies. No, they didn't want just Jerusalem. They got greedy. Meanwhile, St. Francis and his followers are then given safe passage to Jerusalem, where they founded the mission of St. Francis, which exists to this day, 800 years. Meanwhile, the Crusaders, in their arrogance, continued fighting with Sultan al-Kamil, who eventually wiped the floor with them.
What's amazing is literally last night I posted a video with William Henry about St. Francis of Assisi. And here we are today talking about him the next day.
Last things he did, and it was on Christmas Eve of the year 1223. He gave his one of his last sermons, last masses, and it was about the birth of Jesus. And so we all heard about medieval morality plays because most of the people in Italy couldn't speak, they could speak Italian, but they couldn't read. And in that time, the Bible was only in Latin, so most of them couldn't speak or read or understand Latin. So instead, he told a story, and he had a group of farmers come with their cattle, and he had a young couple with a baby, and he brought in 3 people dressed as the wise men, and he told the story in the form of a play. So it was like, the first nativity scene. And the Italians, and I can say this because I'm Italian, Italians being Italians are like, this is a good idea. I think we can make us some money off this. So then all the woodworkers in Assisi started making little figurines, and that's where the nativity scene comes from. St. Francis of Assisi created it. And to this day, there's nativity scenes everywhere. So I thought I'd say that because this show is going to be airing before Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look at known as the creche or the nativity scene, it was St. Francis who invented that.
That's great. Thank you for adding that. Can you give us one more historical NDE?
Near-death experiences, we tend to think of them as people going into the light, and it's always positive. But they're in about 5 to 10% of the cases, there's the DNDE, the distressing near-death experience, also known as the hellish NDE. And everybody watching, I'm sure, has seen some form of the holiday classic, A Christmas Carol. Let's think about this for a minute. Charles Dickens, fascinating man who was involved in the spiritualist movement of Victorian England and was very much interested in psychic phenomena. This was also at a time when they didn't know what to call these things. They knew that people died and came back to life. So there's these mysterious resurrections. So let's examine the evidence. So he writes about Ebenezer Scrooge, a man driven by ego, greed, money, a miserable, rotten guy. And it's Christmas Eve, and he goes home, and what does he encounter? The spirit of Jacob Marley, his partner who died, covered in chains and money boxes, holding the sins and the karma of a self-centered existence. Says, Ebenezer, you must change. Bah, humbug. Then Scrooge has this experience where three different ghosts come to him. The Ghost of Christmas Past, which shows him as a young man when there was love in his life, and he wasn't such a bad guy, but then how things started getting dark when he became materialistic. Then there was the Ghost of Christmas Present, which was showing him the people around him that he could be part of their lives, but he's chosen to exclude them, and even some of the things people are saying behind his back. These encountering Jacob Marley can be analogized to entering the light and encountering loved ones. There wasn't anyone that loved Scrooge, but Jacob Marley was the closest thing that he came to it. Then we have the life review, which is a component of every near-death experience, which would be the Ghost of Christmas Past and the Ghost of Christmas Present to show you what's going on. Now, it takes a darker turn into the distressing near-death experience, the hellish ND, when it shows the future, where Scrooge dies. People are laughing at him, mocking at him. He sees a gravestone that nobody leaves flowers at, that his life didn't matter. He also sees how, because of his neglect towards Bob Cratchit, that Tiny Tim dies. Then he comes out of it and realizes, and he goes, hey, what do you mean it's Christmas morning? The ghosts can do whatever they want. It looks like he'd gone through into the future, but now came back in time. Another aspect of NDEs, which I explain in the afterlife frequency, about on the quantum level, time as we know it doesn't exist. And that's also another factor that NDEers discuss, is the timelessness of time. So, was A Christmas Carol based on a distressing near-death experience where the main character had the life review and a distressing near-death experience, which people who have these DNDEs come out of it and their life totally changes? Did they go to hell, or were they receiving a cosmic wake-up call? We know that Charles Dickens was an incredible writer, an amazing intellect. He himself survived brushes with death many times, including a train wreck, which did, for the record, occur after A Christmas Carol. But maybe he had a near-death experience, or maybe through his psychical research work encountered people that had this mysterious resurrection, which they didn't know what to call it then. Ladies and gentlemen, I rest my case.
That was great. Thanks for sharing that for us.
Oh, thank you for allowing me to talk about it. It's cool, isn't it? I mean, I saw, like, when I was talking about it, and all of a sudden you're like, yeah, because I was looking at this and I started writing it, and then I did research and I found, like, Bruce Grayson and a couple other people said they think so too. And at first, my first thought was, damn, it was my idea. And then it was like, oh, wait, if I'm thinking on the same level as these people, you know, so a lot of them, and if you get me going, I'll go on, and I could get into the whole Pharaoh thing, but I gotta, bring that down maybe next time.
Yes.
So
Yeah. Your new book is called The Afterlife Frequency. How did you come up with that title?
I had submitted the manuscript to my publisher, New World Library, and they loved it. And they said, but we're not sure about the title. And I wasn't either, because I had a couple working titles. And I decided to go for a walk on the beach. I live near the beach, and so I walk down on the beach, and I do that when I get writer's block and I need a creative burst. There's something about walking along the ocean, and I was barefoot, and the water was lapping up my toes as I'm walking, just where the waves are lapping up on the beach. And I said, well, the book's about frequency and it's about the afterlife. And then it hit me, the afterlife frequency. I said, I kind of like that. And so I ran back home and I got on the computer and I did a search for books with the title The Afterlife Frequency, not a one. So then I called my publisher and I said, this is the title. And there was a pause and she said, I love it. so so that's how I got the name.
Well, how is this book different from many other books that are written by mediums?
This book stands apart from other books written by mediums, and I'm not denigrating or downplaying my colleagues, but what I do is I'm taking mediumship out of, because all the terminology of the mediumship was developed during the era of Abraham Lincoln and the 19th century, the Victorian era. I bring it into the 21st century, and I developed the term the electromagnetic soul. And that is a 21st century term to describe what we really are, which is pure consciousness, a soul, which is eternal electromagnetic energy, because energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. Every great belief system teaches us that the soul pre-exists the body, comes into the body, moves on after the body dies. But it goes even further than that, because the electromagnetic soul theory, the EMS, which has been adopted by a number of scientists who study the afterlife, and that was a real honor to get the EMS theory accepted, provides a sound scientific basis for mediumship, for deathbed visions, where people who are dying, seeing loved ones around them, for reincarnation, for near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. So it provides a sound scientific basis for every form of spirit communication, and it's based on quantum physics. So whereas the other books written by mediums tend to focus strictly on mediumship, and the bulk of mediums have no idea how we're able to do this. And I explain this in the afterlife frequency, that it's not only based on quantum physics, but also on physiology. So there's human physiology, there's bioelectrical functions in our body, also keyed into two areas within our body, the pineal gland in the brain and the solar plexus in the pit of the stomach. And the solar plexus, the second most complex bundle of nerves outside of the body, outside of the cerebral cortex in the body. And it's called the second brain. So taking all of this in conjunction with our scientific understanding of quantum mechanics, string theory, and frequency, I explain how all of this works. And that's why it's been so widely accepted by scientists. It's won 3 awards, and it's been designated as one of the top books about faith in God by prettyprogressive.com. It's been endorsed by major organizations like Spiritual Awakenings International, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, Helping Parents Heal, the Edgar Association for Research and Enlightenment, the Center for Consciousness in the United States, and the Galileo Commission in the UK. And so people are finding that this is the book which is explaining how all this is not hocus pocus. It's a real phenomenon based on sound scientific principles.
Are you saying that everybody can do this, but depending on your anatomy, some people, it may come easier for them?
Precisely. Everybody can have a psychic or a mediumistic experience, but that doesn't mean that everyone's a psychic or a medium. I mean, I talked about Michael Phelps earlier. He's always one of my favorite Olympic athletes. I mean, 20-something gold medals. The guy's, he's amazing. We can all swim, but we're not all going to be a Michael Phelps. We can all play piano, but we're not going to be an Elton John. We can all do math, but we're not going to be a Max Tegmark or a Max Planck, with that. I would say Albert Einstein. The funny thing is Einstein came up with the concepts, but he had people doing the math for him, which is really funny. But it was there's reasons for that. But his brilliance was just transcendent. And the thing is, we're all good at doing different things. Some people are simply better at this than others. Some people are better athletes. Some people are better musicians. Some people are better, at scholastic type things. So yes, we can all do this, and we all do have these experiences. And my book, The Afterlife Frequency, teaches people my raft technique. And if you'll indulge me in a story, here I was in my office, and I'm like, how do I explain to people who aren't mediums how and what happens during a mediumistic experience? So I hit the dreaded writer's block. So once again, I thought, well, I'll do my cure-all. I'll go for a walk on the beach. So Jeff, I'm headed down my driveway, and all of a sudden, I get this tingly sensation. Now I know when I start getting cold chills and tingles and nothing scary around me, like there's not a German Shepherd chasing me. I know it's a spirit. So it directed me down this bike path away from the ocean. It's about midday, and I see these two objects shining in the light. And I walk up, it's in a nickel and a penny. And my parents are in spirit, and I hear my mother's voice. If they're not heads up, it's bad luck. And I start laughing because the Italian side of my family has a superstition for every occasion. And I hear my dad's voice then say, it's money, grab it. So I'm laughing, and I'm holding this nickel and this penny in my hand. I go, oh, 6 cents. And then I go, 6 cents. I go, okay, mom, dad, what's the message? And the cold chills and tingles. So I knew I was directed right there. And all of a sudden, Jeff, I saw a vision in my mind's eye of my dad standing in the ocean holding this blue raft that had these yellow, like rubber bumpers on the end of it. Now, my dad, he was a Navy SEAL, but he also used to teach swimming lessons at the Y. And I remember he had this blue raft, and I'm like, raft? Why is he showing me a raft? And then I heard my parents' voices in unison. Recognize signs from spirits, accept them as real, feel without overthinking, trust the message. And I go, raft, R-A-F-T. And I ran back here, and the words just flowed. The writer's block was gone. I wrote like 30 paragraphs about all this. And of course, go back and clean it up and all. But they walked me through it. You see, when I saw the coins, I got the cold chills and tingles, I recognized the sign from a spirit. I accepted it as real. It's the third step where people screw up. I felt without overthinking. Earlier, I was talking about how during a reading, we do the triangle and people block it. Oh, this is just a coincidence. This can't be real. That's when you sabotage it. That's where most people go wrong. They start hyperanalyzing, overthinking, knowing. Get that out of the way, and then trust the message. And so many people who've read the Afterlife Frequency have contacted me and said now that they're employing the raft technique, they're noticing signs from their loved ones in spirit all over the place. That's why, the Afterlife Frequency is the ideal gift for someone who's facing life without a loved one, because it does help you understand that a relationship with someone that you love who has died didn't disintegrate. It's transformed from one of a physical nature to now one of a spiritual nature, and you can recognize, accept, feel, and trust the signs from spirits.
Mark, after watching this podcast, people may want to reach out to you and ask you questions. Are you open to that?
I'm a pretty busy guy, but what I would suggest is if people have questions, call into my weekly live stream show, The Psychic and the Doc. And I do that on the Transformation Network. My co-host, Dr. Pat Basili, is a world-renowned behavioral psychologist. And if you go to my website, which is afterlifefrequency.com, just like my latest book, The Afterlife Frequency, in the calendar of events, you'll see how to click on, and you can tune in, you can watch us, you can listen to us on the radio. We're worldwide, and we take calls from listeners. We'll all do mini readings in tandem with Dr. Pat's uplifting insights, and we help a lot of people. And so I encourage people to call into my show because, if you start sending me the message to ask lengthy questions, think about your question can help a lot of people. So instead of it just being an individualized thing, we can help a lot of people. So I encourage people to call into The Psychic and the Doc. And I'm on every Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Mountain and 4 p.m. Pacific. And to find out how to do that, visit my website, afterlifefrequency.com.
Speaking of helping people, do you feel like what you're doing now is helping far many more people than practicing law?
I think so, very much so. I believe that because, and I did enjoy practicing law and I do like helping people, but in what I'm doing now, I'm supposed to be doing this now. And I took the skills that I had as an attorney, my ability to write research, to be a public presenter, and shifted those into the spiritual realm. And based on the feedback that I'm getting, I'm reaching a much larger audience of people that need help coping with the loss of a loved one. So to answer your question directly, yes.
Is there anything else that you're working on that you want people to know about?
Well, I've got a 2025 US tour coming up. And so I welcome people once again to visit my website, afterlifefrequency.com. You can find out about scheduling a reading with me. You can sign up for my newsletter. You can find out about ordering my books and, of course, tuning into The Psychic and the Doc. I also write for Best Holistic Life magazine. And so you can subscribe to that. You can find that on my website as well. It's a beautiful magazine that every month there's spiritual and uplifting articles, and I've been honored to be designated a VIP executive contributor. So you can find out about all of these things by visiting afterlifefrequency.com.
Before we wrap it up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
I'm going to reiterate the message my mom's spirit gave to me because I think it's the most beautiful message I've ever received. It is my life's mission to help people understand that the divine power we call God exists, that the afterlife, heaven, nirvana, whatever you want to call it, exists, that our souls, our electromagnetic soul, is an eternal, living, immortal being, that humans can communicate with spirits and do, and that we will be reunited with our loved ones when it is our appointed time to leave this material world, and we will see our loved ones in the light.
Mark, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate the work you do. And to all the listeners, please keep tuning in to Jeff Mara's podcast. And God bless all of you. Namaste. And for the holiday season, I always like to tell everyone, have a merry Ramahana Badi Dwali Kwanzmas and a happy New Year.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for watching the Jeff Mara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.